Thomas sat in his sunlit study, flipping through pages of a thick, leather-bound book. He had been looking forward to this moment for years. Retirement, the long-awaited opportunity to savor life's simpler pleasures. He imagined peaceful mornings, reading, afternoons tinkering in his garden, and evenings filled with the quiet joy of simply being. What he hadn't imagined, though, was the constant barrage of phone calls, unexpected visitors, and subtle demands that seemed to grow louder as he got older. His children, now adults with families of their own, had always been close. Thomas loved them dearly and had never hesitated to offer advice or lend a hand when they needed it. But something had shifted. Instead of occasional calls seeking his wisdom or support, the requests became frequent and often trivial. "Dad, can you watch the kids tomorrow? We've got a last-minute trip. Can you lend us a bit to cover the car repair? What do you think of this investment? Could you look it over tonight?" Even his friends, who once dropped by for easy conversation, now seemed to come with ulterior motives. A neighbor stopped by to borrow tools more often than to share a cup of coffee. A former colleague asked Thomas to review a manuscript, just a quick glance, though it turned out to be a 300-page tome. At first, Thomas brushed it off. "They need me," he told himself. "I'm happy to help." But as the weeks turned into months, he noticed a change in himself. The joy he had once felt in lending a hand started to erode. The garden was growing weeds. His books sat unopened, on the shelves. He found himself constantly behind schedule on his own projects, his own dreams. It was as if he was running a marathon, but never reaching the finish line. When he tried to set boundaries, the responses often stung. "I didn't think you'd mind," his son said when Thomas turned down another babysitting request. "We're family after all." A friend's disappointed sigh, after Thomas politely declined a favor, weighed on him for days. One afternoon, exhausted and unsure of how to regain control of his time, Thomas stumbled upon a video of Denzel Washington delivering a powerful commencement speech. "You can't move forward if you're always looking back," Denzel said, "and you can't help everyone if it means losing yourself." The words struck a chord deep within Thomas. For years, he had defined himself by what he could do for others. He had prided himself on being dependable, available, and generous, but now he saw the flip side. In bending to everyone's requests, he had lost his own sense of peace. It wasn't that he wanted to shut people out. It was that he needed to start protecting his own time and energy if he was ever going to find the happiness he had worked so hard for. The next time his phone rang, Thomas took a deep breath. When his friend began his usual routine, an enthusiastic greeting followed by a favor request, Thomas responded kindly but firmly. "I'm sorry, I can't help this time." There was a moment of silence on the line, and then a quick, "Sure, no problem." The call ended, and Thomas stared at the phone in disbelief. He had expected pushback, an argument, or a guilt trip, but instead it was simple, and the sense of relief that followed was immense. He realized he had been underestimating people's ability to adjust, and overestimating the pressure he felt to always say yes. Thomas didn't shut everyone out. He still spent time with his family, supported his friends, and lent a helping hand when he truly wanted to. But now his boundaries were clear, and his time was his own. He wasn't just retiring from work, he was retiring from the pressure to always be everything to everyone. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something new, the quiet joy of choosing peace. Maria had always been her own toughest critic. As a painter, her creative process was deeply personal, a dialogue between herself and the colors on her palette. In her younger years, she exhibited her work in small galleries, winning a few modest awards. People admired her bold brushstrokes, her vivid interpretation of landscapes, and the way she could make a canvas come alive. But after retirement, The gallery invitations dwindled. Some of her old friends drifted away, and in their place came unsolicited opinions from a new cast of characters, neighbors, acquaintances, even her own family. "Why are you still painting?" her nephew asked one afternoon, flipping through her most recent works with a frown. "It's not like you're selling them anymore." Maria tried to explain that it wasn't about selling. It was about the process, the joy, the escape. But his words stayed with her. Soon after, a former colleague stopped by for tea and casually mentioned, "I guess it's nice to have a hobby, though you could spend your time on something more practical. Have you thought about volunteering?" Maria's chest tightened at the remark, but she only smiled and nodded. Then, at her next family dinner, her brother-in-law chimed in, "It must be tough, still doing the same thing after all these years. Maybe it's time to put the brush down and try something new." The critiques were subtle, often delivered with a smile, but they weighed heavily. It wasn't just their words, it was the cumulative effect. Every passing comment made Maria doubt herself. She started painting less and second-guessing her compositions. Her vibrant colors began to fade, and her once joyful studio felt colder. She began to wonder, were they right? Was she just clinging to something that no longer mattered? One evening, Maria sat in her dimly lit studio, staring at a blank canvas. She hadn't painted in weeks. Her brushes sat untouched, her paints dried at the edges. In her solitude, she opened her tablet and clicked on a motivational video she'd saved. The screen flickered to life, and there was Denzel Washington standing on a stage, delivering a commencement speech. He spoke of resilience, of blocking out noise, of building a life not defined by others, but driven by your own sense of purpose. "You'll never be criticized by someone doing more than you," he said, his voice steady. "You'll only be criticized by someone doing less." Maria sat back, the words sinking in. She realized that none of her critics understood what painting meant to her. It wasn't just a hobby. It wasn't about selling or recognition. Painting was her way of being alive, of connecting with something larger than herself. It was the one place she felt free. Denzel's speech gave Maria clarity. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need their approval. What she needed was to remember why she started painting in the first place, because it made her heart beat faster, because it let her see the world in ways others could not. It was her sanctuary, her joy. The next morning, Maria returned to her studio. She picked up a brush and dipped it into a vibrant blue. The paint met the canvas, and for the first time in months, she felt alive again. She decided that from now on, she would only surround herself with people who lifted her up. The critics, the ones who drained her confidence, who couldn't see beyond their own narrow perspective, would no longer have a place in her life. As she worked, she felt lighter. Her brush moved freely, her colors bold once more. Maria realized that her best work, her truest self, could only emerge when she let go of the shadows cast by others' doubts. From then on, she painted not to please them, but to nourish her soul. As he stood on his back porch, overlooking a neatly trimmed lawn that he no longer enjoyed tending, Henry felt the weight of a new kind of exhaustion. For years, he had worked tirelessly as a school principal, putting out fires, solving problems, and guiding young minds toward their potential. Retirement, he had assumed, would bring a well-deserved respite. Quiet mornings, afternoons spent reading, perhaps a little travel. But instead his days felt even busier, filled with constant calls and visits that left him too drained to focus. On his own needs, it started small. A neighbor would pop by to ask for a hand moving something heavy. A former colleague would call, venting about his struggles at work. Family members would ring him up with quick questions that turned into lengthy debates about their choices. At first, Henry didn't mind. After all, wasn't this what he'd always done? Help people sort through their challenges, offer wisdom, and keep things running smoothly. But as the weeks rolled on, The favors grew more frequent, the complaints more persistent. People seemed to seek him out for every little thing. "Henry, I know you're retired now, so you've got the time. Could you drive me to my doctor's appointment? Can you help me fill out this insurance paperwork? Could you take a look at my resume?" By the end of each day, he was too tired to pick up the novel he'd been looking forward to reading or to take the evening walks he used to love. His retirement felt less like a retreat and more like a continuation of the administrative juggling act he'd hoped to leave behind. The turning point came after a particularly draining afternoon. A friend from his neighborhood association had asked Henry to mediate yet another petty dispute, this time over the placement of a trash can. After 2 hours of back and forth, Henry came home feeling irritable and worn out. He plopped into his favorite chair, turned on his TV, and stumbled across a motivational speech by Denzel Washington. The actor spoke about discipline, purpose, and, most importantly, knowing where to place your energy. "Don't let others pull you into their mess," Denzel said. "Be intentional with your time. Protect what matters most." Henry turned off the TV and sat in silence for a moment. The truth was simple, even if it was hard to admit. He had been giving away his energy without thinking. He was retired, but he had not learned to protect his time. His days were still shaped by the needs of others, rather than by his own desires. It wasn't that he didn't care about helping people, it was that he had forgotten that his peace mattered too. He realized he had to learn how to say no without guilt, how to set boundaries without feeling selfish. The next time a call came asking for a favor, Henry paused before answering. "I'm sorry, but I can't help today," he said, his voice steady. He braced himself for pushback, but to his surprise, the other person simply said, "Okay, I understand," and hung up. That small victory gave him confidence. He started turning down requests that didn't fit into the life he wanted to build. He made time for his morning coffee on the porch, for walks in the park, and for the books that had been gathering dust on his shelves. Some of his acquaintances faded away, but Henry didn't mind. Those who remained, the ones who truly cared about his well-being, respected his boundaries. Slowly, his days became his own again. Henry learned that energy, in old age, was more precious than any currency. By protecting it, he discovered a sense of freedom and peace that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't retreating from life, he was reclaiming it. Grace lived in a house filled with memories. Every corner held a story, a picture on the wall from her first trip to Paris, a porcelain dish passed down from her mother, and the worn rocking chair where she nursed her babies decades ago. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a cozy, sentimental place, but for Grace, the house sometimes felt like a prison, a constant reminder of the people and events that had once brought her joy, but now only stirred pain. For years, Grace carried the weight of unresolved grievances. There was the fallout with her younger sister, who had borrowed money and never paid it back. There was the betrayal of her closest friend, who had spread rumors that fractured their social circle. And then there were the words left unsaid between Grace and her late husband, the arguments, the disappointments, and the regrets that lingered long after he was gone. It all played like a broken record in her mind, making it hard to enjoy the present. Even visits from her children and grandchildren didn't bring the happiness they once did. Every smile, every laugh was shadowed by the bitterness she felt inside. One sleepless night, Grace stumbled upon a video of Denzel Washington delivering a commencement speech. His commanding voice filled the quiet room. "If you don't forgive, you're not hurting them, you're hurting yourself," he said. "You can't move forward while you're holding on to the past." Grace leaned forward, replaying that part of the speech. Something inside her shifted. She realized that all these years she had been punishing herself more than anyone else. Her sister had moved on, her old friend had vanished, and her husband's memory couldn't argue back. But Grace, she was the one who remained stuck. chained to the pain and resentment she had kept alive for so long. The next morning, Grace did something she hadn't done in years. She took out a notebook and began to write. She wrote letters to her sister, to her friend, and even to her husband. They weren't letters she planned to send. They were letters she needed to release, to give her emotions a place to go. As the words spilled out onto the paper, she began to feel lighter. She wrote about her anger, her sadness, and finally, her forgiveness. Not because they deserved it necessarily, but because she deserved peace. Over the following weeks, Grace made small but meaningful changes. She started calling her sister, not to rehash old grievances, but to talk about her garden, her favorite books, and the everyday moments that brought a smile. She reached out to a friend from her church and invited her over for tea. Slowly, she let herself be present in the now, instead of replaying the then. Her house didn't change, but it felt different. The pictures on the wall no longer weighed her down. The rocking chair became a place of comfort again, where she could sit and watch the sun rise. Grace realized that she couldn't rewrite the past, but she could decide how it shaped her future. She chose to keep her distance from those who still brought negativity, even family members who stirred old wounds. Instead, she surrounded herself with those who truly cared, who uplifted her, and who brought peace to her days. By letting go of the chains of her past, Grace discovered something unexpected. She found not just peace, but hope. In forgiving others, and more importantly, forgiving herself, she opened the door to a new chapter of her life, one filled with love, light, and a quiet joy she thought she'd never feel again.